We saw last time that authors of the different Gospels, we have Matthew, the attribution goes back to the earliest testimonies. We saw Papias, Irenaeus, Origen, Eusebius, the first extant church history, Jerome, and he was the one in all the lists of the apostles, the only person who's ever been regarded as the person writing Matthew. Complete unanimity. We saw that pseudepigraphical writings. What is the two words that make up pseudepigraphical?
Pseudo and graphical?
Pseudo and graphic, kind of graphic. Pseudo is what?
Pseudonym or...
And what is a pseudonym? Fake name.
Exact definition.
Pseudonym is a fake name. So what is a pseudepigraphical writing? Fake.
Fake writing?
Yeah, it's fake. So false, it's a gospel pretending to be by whoever when it's not really by that person. So different pseudepigraphical, uninspired writings have all kinds of different names, but the canonical gospels only have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we saw that, and we saw that unity of titles means that, that's a good reason to think that it's actually by who it says. So let's talk about Mark now. So, 15 lines of evidence. Matthew was written circa AD 40, well before the final part of the first century. We saw James references Matthew over 35 times. The earliest extant posted book of writings, the Epistle of Barnabas, 1 Clement, and so on, do so as well. Now, some of these writings too, Epistle of Barnabas, 1 Clement, the Didache, the letters of Ignatius and Polycarp,
What's that number 5? What's that? Like, number 5, what is it?
The Didache?
Yeah.
That just means teaching. It's this work that just kind of gives some good moral advice. It gives advice about this and about that. These things are worth reading. If you've never read 1 Clement or the Didache or Polycarp, they're worth reading. I mean, don't stop reading the Bible reading, but they are worth reading. They're interesting. Interesting early uninspired documents. But some of those dates too, people who take later dates for the Gospels will push those back as well. So, because they recognize these writings quote the Gospels, so if you want to make the Gospel later, you end up pushing these later as well. Recognizing the Gospels are earlier, you push those earlier within certain limits as well. The Epistle of Barnabas was not written by the Barnabas mentioned in the Bible. But 1 Clement could very possibly have been the Clement mentioned in Philippians 4:3. Possibly. We saw that Matthew's written before the destruction of the temple. James was not yet martyred. Remember Matthew 10:2, it says the names of the 12 apostles are these. While Mark and Luke use a past tense because they were written after AD 42, so James had died already. We saw thousands of Greek manuscripts in their headings, gave different dates. And they say Matthew was written 41. We saw those other authors, Eusebius, Cosmas, Theophylact. Unanimous ancient testimony that Matthew was the first gospel. There's no evidence for a later date. And P64 is an early copy of Matthew that Carson Peter Fine is dated to circa AD 60. So that's very strong.
So those writings are the first book of Matthew?
Yeah, P64 would be the earliest copy of Matthew that we have. We don't have anything earlier, but that's very early. Now, theological liberals dispute Thide's date for P64 as well. They say, no, he's wrong about this dating. They date it more like 8200. But he's given some good reasons. He's a knowledgeable papyrologist, and he's given some good arguments for dating that early. Of course, if it dates that early, then Christ predicts the future in Matthew, and that's a big problem if you want to say that doesn't happen. I mean, because this is before 70. You can't have a copy before 70 because we know that predicted prophecy is impossible. So therefore, this must not be this early. But that's not a good way to make an argument. We saw James has a bunch of references. The liberal date, which dates Matthew 80, 90, there's no evidence at all from anybody who lived back then that dates valid, just made up. Now let's talk about Mark a little bit. Gospel of Mark. Guess who wrote the Gospel of Mark? Mark. Oh, and actually, I should mention this. The different headings, like if you look at an ancient biblical manuscript, it'll say not the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark. There's nothing wrong with saying Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John. It'll say Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark. Because there's one Gospel, see? It's the Gospel of Christ, according to Mark, and according to Matthew, see? So it's not their Gospel, it's Christ's Gospel according to whoever. So that's why they say that, not the Gospel of so-and-so. So just, I think that's worth throwing that in. Now, who was Mark? Who was Mark?
Peter's sidekick.
Peter's sidekick. Oh. So Mark was associated with Peter. What do you think?
So,
Peter, or was it Isaiah? Peter? The epistles are the wives of the apostles? Joan of Arc is Noah's wife, right? No. Okay. Anyway, yeah. Mark was actually associated with Peter. There's good evidence for that. Let's learn a little bit about Mark. Now, Acts 12 and 25 talks about Mark's house. It says, here in Acts 12, this is actually where Peter had been imprisoned. And he got out, they were having a prayer meeting at the house where Mark lived. So here Peter was miraculously delivered from prison, and it says, and when he considered the thing, he is Peter, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John. John Mark, that is. John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. So they were having a prayer meeting in Mary's house. And Mary was the mother of John Mark. And of course, Peter's knocking on the door, and they don't believe it's Peter, and they are amazed that he's there. And then they finally realize, okay, we got to get this guy in. Mark goes away, we'll talk about where he goes, or Peter goes away, we'll talk about where he goes in a little bit. So, but Mary, the mother of John, was, pretty significant. You had these women that were helping during Christ's ministry, and Mark was her son. So Mark would have certainly had lots of interaction with people who were associated with Christ's ministry. Do you remember in Mark's gospel mentions this person who has a cloth around his naked body, and then the soldiers lay hold of him, and he leaves his garment and runs away naked? And that's only recorded in Mark.
I don't remember about that.
Yeah, but next time I read Mark, notice that it's at the end.
That was
Yeah.
Mark. Huh?
I mean, you might think, who is this guy? Okay,
Who is he?
it's possible that is Mark.
Oh,
Okay, which would explain why it's in Mark, but you can't prove that. Okay, you cannot prove that it's Mark. Don't make that your hill to die on. Okay, but it is at least a possibility. Though actually, it's not the greatest evidence for that. But anyway, it's worth mentioning. So anyway, so here in Acts 12, Mark obviously would have had a lot of associations with people who were very close to the Lord. And who did Paul take with him on the first missionary journey? Kind of got scared and left.
gentleman right here.
Yeah, Mark. Mark was going to go along, though I guess the going got a little too tough, and he turned back. Now, none of us would have turned back. I mean, getting beaten up, stoned. Yeah, it's just a long day's work. But that we get afraid to give somebody a tract, but stoning. Anyway. But yeah, so Mark obviously was around a lot of these movers and shakers. He would have had a lot of opportunity to hear a lot of truth and interact with a lot of people. There's a John Mark he's mentioned 10 times in the New Testament. Acts as a young man in whose house the church Jerusalem met, or at least they had a prayer meeting there. They actually met in Solomon's porch of the temple, so they could all fit in one place. But at least they had a prayer meeting there, some people. And who accompanied Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. We also see Mark in Colossians and Philemon. Mark is mentioned as someone with Paul during his first Roman imprisonment. So Mark did overcome his fears to be willing to identify here and help Paul out. So here in Colossians 4:10, we have, and Philippians, or Philemon around 24, we have a reference to Mark. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom you receive commandments, and come unto you receive. So we have Mark mentioned there, Mark in Philippians. In 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul wanted to have Mark with him. So Mark had grown spiritually and was now, it says, only Luke is with me, take Mark and bring him with you, for he's profitable to me for the ministry. So Mark there was profitable to the Apostle Paul at this point. Mark was also serving with Peter. 1 Peter 5:13, the Mark is called, Peter calls him his son in the faith. It was his literal son. Peter was married, but Mark was his son in the faith. So 1 Peter 5:13, the church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son. So Mark was greeting the audience, the people that got 1 Peter, along with the church of Babylon. And Babylon was a code name. It is Rome. Do you remember, what are the four empires in the book of Daniel? Daniel has a vision of like a big statue, gold head, silver arms, goes down to feet, 2 feet. There's also other four sequences of 4 empires in Daniel. Remember what the 4 empires are?
No.
It's like Greece and Rome.
Greece and Rome were in there, okay, yeah.
And, well, also Babylon would have been, the gold was the top.
Thou art the head of gold.
That's
Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, thou art the head of gold. So Babylon's the first one.
Then the bottom is Rome.
Yeah. So you have Babylon, you have Medo-Persia. Then you have Greece.
I forgot
Alexander
that
the Great.
was Medio.
And then Daniel talks about how the Greeks conquered very fast. Daniel 11 takes place under Greece, the Titus 50s. And then Rome is the 4th empire. And even the split of Rome into 2 parts, the east and the west, I think the 2 legs fits in, because of course Rome fell, but Constantinople stayed for another 1,000 years. And Rome, the Roman church state is still extant in Vatican City. And they are going to be the base of the future revived Roman Empire. But, one second, I'll answer your question. But here, that's one reason why Babylon can be this code name for Rome, because there's this continuity. This is the empire of the world. This Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greek, Rome, this is the world's kingdom, in contrast to God's kingdom, which the Messiah will bring in, and has a partial fulfillment in Israel and so on, and then the church. But, so that's one reason why they can call Rome Babylon. That's one reason in Revelation 17, the Apostle John can call the city on the 7 hills Mystery Babylon, because of that continuity of 4 empires. And also, they were wicked like Babylon was too. Yes, question?
Alright, so it was, so the 4 empires were Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome?
Yes.
Okay.
And the Persian, the Medes and the Persians were a coalition.
Okay.
Medes and Persians. Kind of like, you can think like the UK, United Kingdom, is like the Welsh and the Scots, and they all are together, right?
Right.
So the Medo-Persian Empire, the Medes and Persians.
Alright.
So yeah, so here first Peter's at Rome, and Mark is with him, and they're serving together. And by the way, this is the main point, but if you speak to Muslims, because the Quran says positive things about the gospel, they like to say Paul was like this very bad person, while Christ's apostles who were during his ministry, they were good. So Peter and the other people who were with Christ were teaching something. They were teaching the Muslim Jesus, and then Paul came along, and Paul invented basically Christianity. He got the death and resurrection for sin going. He got the deity of Christ going. Before they were all Muslims, okay, which is totally historically like incredibly bad. But notice even here with Mark is with Peter, he's Peter's son in the faith, but he's working with Paul too. So what happened to the where's this their enemies thing? Okay, Mark isn't going to Paul and saying, "You heretic! How dare you teach Jesus is God? He rose from the dead." Okay, they're all teaching the same thing. Peter is more focused on the Jews, and Paul is more focused on the Gentiles, but they're teaching the same thing. Okay, so that is just totally made up. It's just to try to justify the errors of Paul, right? But anyway, so you can see Mark here. Mark is there a bunch, and Mark is with Peter, mentioned in 1 Peter 5:13. Now, Papias, who again heard John preach, Papias said, Mark, having become the expounder of Peter, wrote down accurately the things said or done by Christ. He followed Peter, and he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. Mark committed no error when he thus wrote. Okay, so that was what Papias said in the exposition of the oracles of the Lord about Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel too, Matthew emphasizes Christ as the Messianic King. Mark's Gospel emphasizes the Christian life of service by the example of the life of Christ. Okay, so Mark emphasizes Christ more as a servant than the servant of Jehovah in Isaiah, but he's this servant who is the pattern for believers. In Rome is the capital of a worldwide empire, right? When you have a worldwide empire, what do you need you need something to kind of keep everybody in control. What would you need if you have a worldwide empire?
It's missing. Spear.
Yeah, how are you going to do that?
Guards all over the
Yeah, lots of soldiers.
Yep.
You need to be a big army. Big empire, you got a big army. Doesn't work. No army, no empire, right? So there's going to be a lot of Roman soldiers, civil servants, people who understand the concept of service to the state. Remember the Roman centurion told Christ, I'm one who's under authority, and I tell people to go when they go, and to come when they come. And so I understand how this works. So in Acts 10 and 11, you have the centurion as well, one of the first Gentile converts. And so Mark in this Rome, the capital of the empire, was written to emphasize this life of service by the example of Christ as a servant. So Mark's gospel. So one writer said, the gospel opens without a genealogy, as in Matthew, for we do not inquire about the genealogy of a servant, but rather the qualification for efficient service. So if you have a servant, you don't say, well, whose son are you? Let me hear your heritage, right? If you're a servant, you make sure he knows what he's doing. He knows how to fix the cars, the chariots, right? He fixes the chariots, right? So Mark calls Christ Lord plenty of times, but Mark tends to omit the word Lord in comparison with Matthew. Okay, Matthew mentions it more because Matthew's emphasizing kingly role. Mark is emphasizing servant. So the disciples are companions in service rather than men commanded to go. And in Mark, when others need Christ, he's their servant ever ready to do them good. So Mark's emphasizing that servant role more. So Mark also has more Latin words, apart from proper names, than other New Testament documents. And he uses Latin terms not found in other Gospels. So for example, if you look at Mark 6:27, and of course, Latin is the language of empire. Were they able to figure that out? Oh, good, great. So Mark 6:27, it says, immediately the king sent an executioner. That word executioner is speculator. I don't know if the English word speculate comes from that or not, but a speculator is an executioner. I guess you speculate in penny stocks and you get executed. That wouldn't be a legitimate linguistic thing. But that's a Latin term that's not used in the other Gospels.
Speculate, right? The Roman fallacy.
Yeah. So the executioner, that's a Latin term that Mark uses. Mark also uses the Roman system of calculating time rather than the Jewish one because it was written in Rome. So for example, look at Mark 6:48. Obviously the day still has 24 hours and stuff, but how they calculated it is different. So Mark 6:48. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. So 4th watch of the night. So Roman reckoning divided the night into 4 watches. You had 6 to 9 p.m., 9 to 12 p.m., 12 to 3 a.m., and 3 to 6 a.m. So 4th watch of the night is between 3 and 6 a.m. And so that's when Christ was walking on the water. I've walked on water too.
3 and 6 a.m.?
3 and 6 a.m. Yeah. Now the water was frozen and very thick. But I have walked on water. Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't a miracle when I did, though. Okay. So, in the Dead Sea, actually, you can also stand, if you go to Israel, you can stand straight up and not sink all the way. So I've also walked in water without swimming and not fallen in. But it was up to like here. But that's how buoyant it is. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So you sunk down to your...
I sunk down to about here, but I didn't go under. I wasn't swimming. You can just stand in there, kind of. Yeah. So it's pretty interesting.
Is it because of all
All the minerals and stuff, yeah. Yep. So anyway, so we can see 4th watch of the night, 3 to 6 a.m. Were you going to say something?
No, I was telling her that me. I like America.
I like America too. The Israelis like America as well.
Say it right here.
Yeah, Israel likes America.
Except when you go to South Africa to visit nature.
South Africa? Oh, no, we can go anywhere.
All right. So Mark 13:35 is another example of this Roman time. Christ says, "Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning." By the way, hopefully you know this, but when I first started reading the Bible, I didn't, so I need to make sure you do. At even. What does that mean, at even? Even. Evening. Yeah, it's not like even, like we're having an even deal here. Even means evening. So at evening.
Oh, that's what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew that.
Good, yeah, I'm glad. But when I first started, I did not know. Even is evening. You didn't know? Okay, well good. So here we go, yeah. Even is evening. So evening or midnight. Now, cock crowing, by the way. Notice that cock crowing is a time of day. I think actually that they named that 3rd division of the night cock crowing because that's when the roosters would start to belt it out, all right? And I think that actually helps explain when Christ says, "You'll betray me 3 times before cock crowing," in Matthew and Luke, while Mark mentions your rooster will crow at least twice. So I think that actually part of the explanation for that, I think, could very well relate to cock crowing being a time of the night. So before the cock crowing, you'll deny me 3 times.
I just think that this one
So.
gospel gave a little more information than the other
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, no, that's
not kind of
no. Yeah, what Mark does give more specific deal as well.
Yeah.
But it's worth throwing in there that Roman use of time cock crowing, and also there's a few other things like Mark uses the coin terms like lepta, copper coins that the widow casts into the poor widow cast in the offering box. Became a Roman quadrans or penny in Mark 12:42. The palace in which the soldiers led Jesus in 15:16 is the praetorium. So, in 15:21, Mark informs us that Simon of Cyrene was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, Romans 16:13 mentions Rufus, and let me take a look at Romans 16:13. So, somebody want to read Mark 15:21?
Which one?
Mark 15:21.
And you compelled one Simon, a Cyrene, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander, and Rufus, to bear his cross.
Okay, good. So here we have Simon, who is helping Christ carry the cross, and it mentions he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And then Romans 16:13 mentions Rufus. Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. By the way, if somebody says election isn't personal, Rufus chosen the Lord, Rufus is a person. It says Rufus was chosen, so, election's personal. But, if Peter's writing the gospel in Rome, or Mark is writing the gospel with that Peter, with Peter's authority in Rome, it would make sense that if Rufus is actually in Rome, Mark adds this detail about who Rufus is in his gospel. He's the son of the person who had to help Christ carry the cross. So interesting little details like that. So we have internal evidence connecting Mark to Rome. All right? Internal evidence. Also, the external evidence is unanimous as well. We have Papias, we have other people who, we'll get to their quotes in a second. Since we're talking about Peter, though, I think it's worth mentioning that in Capernaum, we probably have actually found where Peter's house was. So this is the probable site of Peter's house, and we visited there, didn't we, honey? Yeah, so we got to go see Peter's house in Capernaum. He doesn't live there anymore. He died a long time ago.
Why do they think it's Peter's house?
That's a good question. We're gonna you'll find out. But this is probably Peter's house, and we'll find out why in a little bit. It's right by synagogue. Here's a synagogue, Capernaum. Here is the house of Peter excavations right by the synagogue. You can kind of see in the background here the synagogue, and then closer up the house. So Peter's house appears to have been right next to the synagogue. All right. So that's pretty neat. Most archaeologists, even like secular ones, think that this was Peter's house. So it's not just, some crazy person who thinks the Bible is actually true. I mean, who would think that? But actual, even people who doubt that think this is Peter's house. Now, why? First, most of church history has said that this was the location. And they started excavating here in 1968. And got some good confirmations that this was actually his house. The building was used as a typical home from about 63 BC until 8050. So it was somebody's home for that period of time. Peter and Andrew probably moved the family fishing business from Bethsaida to Capernaum and established their residence in this house. It was a large enough house for an extended family. Mark 1:29 tells us that both Peter and Andrew lived there. But after about 8050, the house changed. So domestic pottery ceased to be used. So in other words, they didn't have like cups and things for domestic pottery. And the walls of the large center room got plastered. And that was very unusual to have plaster on the center walls. And there's graffiti in the house mentioning Jesus as Lord and Christ. In other words, writing on the wall, mentioning Jesus as Lord, mentioning Christ. And so from about 8050, this became a center of Christian worship, this house. And the house church continued for about nearly 300 years. There's over 100 Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Latin, Hebrew graffiti writings scratched on the plastered walls, numerous forms of crosses, a boat, other letters, at least 2 possible occurrences of Peter's name. And then in the 5th century, they built an octagon-shaped church building over the plastered house church with the same area and dimensions to show that the earlier place was special. And so Princeton Seminary New Testament scholar James Charlesworth said, since there are no rival options for Peter's house, and since it was clearly where the house has been discovered or somewhere close to it, it seems valid to conclude that Peter's house may have been excavated and identified. The discovery is virtually unbelievable and sensational, but despite the sensational nature of the find, learned archaeologists and historians have slowly come to the same conclusion. So yeah, seems to be Peter's house. So, pretty good stuff. You can go see it. So Peter's house in Capernaum, a little bit of a rabbit trail, but definitely worth mentioning. Now, Irenaeus also said that we don't know that's what Irenaeus looked like. Okay, Irenaeus also said this concerning Mark's gospel. He said, "Mark, the disciple and expounder of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter." And Against Heresies, book 3:1:1. Now, in this same text, Irenaeus says that Mark wrote the gospel down after the exodus, the Greek word exodus, of Peter and Paul from Rome. If you just heard that, if you said Mark wrote after the exodus of Peter from Rome, what would you think that was talking about?
I don't know.
Sounds like they left Rome.
That he left, yeah, he left. Okay.
Maybe it's after they died.
Or that's, okay, what do you think? Exodus, after he left or after he died? Exodus.
It's cryptic for dying.
Cryptic for dying? Okay. Those are the two things. Yeah, you actually have some argument about that. You know, is Irenaeus saying he did it after he died or after he left Rome? I think it's that he left for the following reasons. Irenaeus never uses exodos. We're talking about the Greek word exodos here, which means departure. He never uses exodos when he wants to say death. For death, he uses thanatos. In the same book 3 of Against Heresies, he uses the word thanatos for death 38 times. So, people who say that Irenaeus are saying Mark wrote his gospel only after Peter was dead, which of course would make it later. When they say that, they're misinterpreting Irenaeus. Irenaeus isn't supporting that. Irenaeus is just saying he wrote it after Peter left. And of course, once Peter's not preaching it, if you want to have written down what Peter wrote, it makes sense for somebody to write it down. So Irenaeus is just saying Mark wrote the gospel, close to or right after Peter left Rome, so people could still have that written record, which is also what other patristic writers say, like the Clement of Alexandria, Papias, giving evidence for an early date of Mark's gospel. So Irenaeus is not evidence against an early date by saying Peter only wrote after he died. It's after he left Rome. Exodus, not thanatos. So Irenaeus said that. Clement of Alexandria, the gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. And so greatly did the splendor of piety illumine the minds of Peter's hearers, that with all sorts of entreaties they besought Mark, a follower of Peter and the one whose gospel is extant, that he would leave them a written monument of the doctrine which had been orally communicated to them. Oh, wrong way. Origin, too. Among the 4 Gospels, the second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, who in his epistle acknowledges him as a son, saying, "The church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, salutes you, and so doth Marcus, my son." I want to give some evidence that Peter actually... Take a look at Acts 12 and verse 7. By the way, does saying Peter went to Rome mean that Peter was the first infallible pope who established the hierarchical Catholic Church? No, not at all. Okay? If somebody wants to say Peter didn't go to Rome, whatever. I think the evidence is pretty good that he did, based on all this, all right? But saying Peter was in Rome and saying that he was the infallible pope of the Roman Catholic Church are radically different things. I went to Rome too, okay? I've been in Rome. I'm not the head of the Catholic Church. It would be fun to be it for a day. If I was the pope for a day, I could declare infallibly that the Roman Church is teaching a false gospel and everyone should leave and become a Baptist. I could put that on TV for the day. The one day I was the pope.
My brother-in-law believes that Peter was the first pope. That's his word to say that.
Yeah, it doesn't say that. It's made up.
Catholics wrote it, they made it up, they tell a lie long enough to come to truth.
Yeah, but I think Peter did actually go to Rome, but that does not at all mean he's the first pope. He was married, okay, right? In his epistle, he talks about all believers being priests to God, 1 Peter 2, so it doesn't sound like a pope. Anyway, but look at Acts chapter 2.
Married, right?
Yeah, he was married, yeah. To his wife, no less. His wife wasn't a nun.
Which one does it say that? Which one does it say that?
It says that in Paul's epistles that Peter had a wife, because Paul says, "Do not I have power to lead about a wife," like Peter and the other apostles. So Paul wasn't married. Yeah, he has a mother-in-law too. Yeah, he has a mother-in-law. Yeah, and he got along well with her because he wanted her to be healed. See, so they weren't, the whole thing. He liked his mother-in-law. So, anyway, I don't know why. I think if you have godly people, I like my mother-in-law is fantastic, right? All right, Acts 12 and verse 17. So this is after Peter. They were going to kill Peter. He was miraculously brought out of the prison, and here it says, but he's knocking at the door, and it says, but he beckoning unto them with a hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, "Go show these things to James and to the brethren," and he departed and went into another place. Now, it doesn't specifically say word for word that he went to Rome. Okay. Now, Rome would be a logical place to kind of be out of the way because it's a very big city. I mean, if you want to hide somewhere and be kind of incognito, I mean, if the government's trying to kill you, you probably don't want to be super prominent. So Rome would be a good place to hide. But there's also there's an allusion here. The exact Greek phrase, another place, is eis heteron topon. That's the exact phrase. That exact phrase only occurs once in the Old Testament in Greek. And that's in Ezekiel 12:3. In Ezekiel 12:3, it's talking about them going into exile to Babylon. That is the other place. So the exact phrase in Acts 12:17 is also employed in Ezekiel 12:3 for exile in Babylon, and Babylon's a code word for Rome. So in Revelation 17:18. So I think that Luke here in Acts is saying Peter went to Rome, but kind of putting it in a way that you would only catch that if you were like a Christian who was kind of in the know. Okay, if you were reading your Old Testament, translated into Greek maybe because you're a Gentile, you would catch this allusion in Ezekiel. But if you're some Roman official, this is not going to tell you anything about where Peter is hiding. Okay, because Peter is still alive when this book of Acts is published. And, you really don't want Luke's gospel to be telling the government where you can find Peter. Okay? So kind of putting it in a way that the Christians would get it, but the Romans wouldn't get it, makes sense. So I think there's an allusion here that supports Peter going to Rome. But here again, that's not going to be a hill to die on. Okay? If you say that's not clear enough, fine. But I think there is an allusion, Ezekiel 12:3, exile to Babylon, they're going to Rome. So, and that is what the external evidence says. And this, I think, is some internal evidence in Scripture for that. Even though, again, like I said, this is not the hill I'm going to die on. But also, other evidence for, and we're going to probably wrap up here right now for today with Peter and Rome. But Bauckham, Dr. Bauckham, a scholar, says the Gospels employ a literary device to indicate precisely the qualification of input from an eyewitness who is qualified to tell the whole gospel story by virtue of participation in it from beginning to end on the part of eyewitness sources. We find it in the Gospel of Mark. Now, the first disciple named in Mark's Gospel, immediately following the outset of Jesus' ministry, is Simon Peter. So Mark 1:16-18 mentions Simon Peter by name. And there's a particular emphasis on Peter's name. He's mentioned twice. So it's emphasizing Peter in Mark 1:16-18. And he was called Simon until Christ renamed him Peter. Okay? Peter is named again right at the end of the gospel. He's the last male disciple mentioned in the gospel, when the women at the empty tomb are told to tell Jesus' disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee, there you will see him. The rather surprisingly specific mention of Peter, who after all was one of the disciples, so why the disciples and Peter, surely points ahead to the resurrection appearance of Jesus to Peter individually. Both Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:5, and Luke 24:34, refer to such an appearance, so that its presence very early in the traditions is certain. Mark's reference to it, so that Peter is the last male disciple named in his gospel, pointing beyond the end of his own narrative, is designed to place Peter as prominently at the end of the story as at the beginning. The two references form an inclusio, like a little thing that brackets the whole gospel, suggesting that Peter is the witness whose testimony includes the whole. This is striking confirmation of the testimony of Papias that Peter was the source of the gospel traditions in Mark's gospel. And you see that kind of inclusio of eyewitness testimony in Luke as well, and in John. John, at the end of John, he is the beloved disciple and the witness testifying these things. So that kind of bracketing of Peter, I think, supports Mark being based on Peter. The evidence of the remarkable frequency with which Peter's name occurs in Mark, that is also coherent with this device of inclusio, to indicate that Peter was the main eyewitness source behind Mark's gospel. The name Simon occurs 7 times. The reference is Simon Peter. This number, the Jewish symbolic number of completeness, might be deliberate. And the name Peter 19 times. This frequency relative to the length of the Gospels is considerably higher in Mark than in the other Gospels. So, numbers of reasons why we would conclude from both internal evidence and external evidence that Mark was written based on Peter's testimony, with Peter's approval in Rome about 42. Let's see. Yeah, I'll put this in here too. Furthermore, a point of considerable importance for our argument that Mark's gospel claims Peter as his principal eyewitness source, Peter is actually present through a large portion of the narrative, from 116 to 1472. The only exceptions are those references there. Strong confirmation that Mark's references to Simon Peter at the beginning and end of his story form a deliberate inclusio comes from Luke's gospel, where the same device appears, and in John. Taken together, these features make Mark a gospel that presents, to a far larger degree than others, a Petrine perspective on the story of Jesus. So we're going to have to wrap it up there. But so internal evidence, external evidence, strong. Mark wrote Mark. We're going to see about AD 42. And Mark had both close connection with lots of eyewitnesses, by his house being where it was in Jerusalem, and also his close association with Peter and Paul. Any comments, questions about that? Yes?
I just have a quick comment about the house of Peter.
Yes, house of Peter.
I took some notes on that.
Oh, from when we were there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, want to read them? What did we say?
Sure.
And we were there at House of Peter.
So
We touched the wall and our sins were forgiven.
there's actually a church
No, they weren't.
built over Peter's house.
Yep.
And you can actually see the actual plasters that the Franciscans found that dug there. There's a sapphos is on the house.
Oh, they did, yeah. So just so the video can hear, I'm going to kind of repeat what you say. So you're there, you can see the church building over it, and they actually, behind a plastic thing, you can see where the name Peter is there on the house.
And it's a very special place because there's a building around it to protect it. Even ancient ruins have a building around it to protect it.
Mm.
And there's a house church that was also that met at one time there.
Yeah, so they had a house church there, they had a building around it to protect it, built a later church building over it. Yep.
And now there's one today. So it's been protected the entire time.
Yeah, been protected the whole time. It's the only candidate, there's no other candidate, nobody says this other house is his house. So lots of good reasons to believe it's Peter's house. And again, Mark's gospel looks like history here. Looks like something that we can rely on.
Preserve it if it wasn't of importance.
Yeah, no, yeah, they wouldn't preserve if it wasn't important. Okay, let's go ahead. Our time is up, so let's go ahead and close in prayer. Lord, we're thankful for the gospel of Mark. Thank you for giving it to us so that we can learn about the Savior of the world. And thank you for the evidence that about how we got it, how you gave it to us, and the eyewitness testimony that it contains. I pray that you would strengthen the faith of believers through these things and help unbelievers to consider whether or not their position is justifiable to reject your word. I pray this for Jesus' sake. Amen. All right, dismissed.